Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from around the world. Now, it's been just a few weeks since Memorial Day behind us, and coming right up ahead is July 4th, Independence Day. So what we're going to do tonight is go back in time to look at significant contributions of Catholics to the American Revolution. And we might even want to think about what would the revolution have been like without heroes like Kazimierz Puławski, Tadeusz Kościuszko, the Carroll brothers, and others. Why did they do it? Here to tell us more about the role of these Catholics during the American Revolution, please welcome the author of a brand new book called Liberty's Lions, the Catholic Revolutionaries Who Established America. Please welcome Mr. Dan Leroy. Dan, welcome.
Father, thank you for having me.
Good to have you. Now, Mr. Dan, exactly why did you start looking at the Catholics in the American Revolution?
There are two reasons for that, and I'm really happy to get to talk about both of them. The first reason is that I was fortunate enough to grow up in a household where history was valued. My mom is a great genealogist, and she always told my brother Drew and me that it's important to know where you come from, and it's important to know how one thing leads to another historically. I don't think there are a lot of people these days who grow up with that kind of upbringing, but we did. So thank you, Mom. And the other place that this came from is, I'm very happy to say, the Perpetual Adoration Chapel at my home parish of St. Monica in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And I'm fortunate to be in a parish that's run by the priests who run it. They do a fantastic job. These guys are really bucking a lot of the cultural trends. And St. Monica and St. Blaise, it's a very special place to worship. So we have a Perpetual Adoration Chapel, and I was in there reading Magnificat, just something that my dad subscribes to for me each month, so thank you, Dad. And I was reading a column by Professor Anthony Esolen about Kazimierz Puławski, the father of the American cavalry. And at the end of this column, Professor Esolen said, you know, there are some other Catholics who made pretty significant contributions to the American Revolution. So I was interested, and I went out looking for the book that would tell me where to find all these stories in one place, and I couldn't find it. So as an author, you're always looking for an angle. What am I going to write about next? This turned out to be what came next.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. Here's one of the things that, you know, it certainly came to mind in looking at your book and dealing with this topic. Catholics weren't particularly welcome in the English colonies. There was one colony that was established for Catholics by a Catholic nobleman. Lord Calvert established Maryland, and he named it after, not Our Lady, but after the Queen of England, who was not Catholic, but still, I'm not against schmoozing. You know, there's ruled, even if the Jewish people weren't here yet, schmoozing is not a bad thing all the time. But, you know, and then Pennsylvania was founded, I think, later, but they had freedom of religion. But in the other colonies, Catholicism was not welcome, and you could not hold office in most of the colonies if you were Catholic.
Including Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Wait a minute, that's the Catholic one. Why couldn't they do it there?
Catholicism is part of Maryland's founding, and it is a significant part of it. As you say, they have a Catholic founder. But even on the Ark and the Dove, when they came over.
The Ark and the Dove? What are those?
The ships that brought them over, to Maryland. Even then, Catholics are outnumbered. So from the very beginning, religious tolerance in Maryland is sometimes more of a theory than a practical application. In Pennsylvania, William Penn has a reputation for being very religiously tolerant. It's also in the charter. But William Penn wasn't always the biggest fan of Catholics. And when push came to shove, when he was up against it back in England, Catholics in Pennsylvania were up against it as a result of that. The pressure kind of flowed across the Atlantic. So even in the most religiously tolerant colonies, sometimes religious tolerance, again, was more of an idea than it was something that Catholics could count on.
In fact, people still go to some of the colonial homes of the early Catholic settlers in Maryland, where they have priest holes. These were hidden little rooms in the walls where priests, many of them were my Jesuit brothers, in fact, had to hide from the colonial police.
You know, we think of that as being something that takes place in England, and of course it did. But what we don't always think about is that a lot of these things found their way across the Atlantic to America. And a lot of these traditions, just like a tradition that is mentioned early in Liberty's Lions, the tradition of Pope's Nights throughout the Northeast. And Pope's
the Pope came here?
Exactly. It sounds like a fun Catholic night out, except it really wasn't. It was an excuse to burn the Pope in effigy, get drunk, and be pretty virulently anti-Catholic in public. And that's a tradition that comes out of the Gunpowder Plot, November 5th. So it's something, again, that finds its way across the ocean to America. So it's a good point.
And so folks understand the Gunpowder Plot was something that happened in London. And it was a plot by some Catholics to blow up the English Parliament.
Guy Fawkes.
Yes.
And so that tradition made its way to the colonies, and it survived really right up until 1775, when George Washington takes over as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And one of the things he says is, we got to knock this off. We cannot ask our fellow Catholic citizens to become part of this enterprise if we're going to insult them publicly. And it's one of the reasons that Washington has a special place for Catholics. He's a guy who doesn't just talk the talk, he also walks the walk.
See, that's something you bring out, especially in your last chapter, that this is, Washington really was not only a good military leader, or I'd say a military leader who learned a lot running away from the British and until eventually he won. But he also was a leader when it came to the issues of our values. And I know there's a lot of controversy about him today, but he did set his slaves free, and he gave his slaves, his former slaves, Mount Washington outside of Cincinnati as a place for them to settle down and have their own farms in freedom.
It sounds funny to say that George Washington is still, in a lot of ways, underrated, and yet I think he actually is. There's kind of become a cottage industry in recent years, trying to poke holes in the myth of Washington. But part of that has led to people, I think, and I shouldn't say led to, because this is something that people in Washington's own time said, people have said, Washington's a guy, he's very disinterested. He doesn't really have any religious beliefs to speak of. He's a deist. He really believes nothing in particular. I think there's a lot of evidence, and I try to get at some of it in the chapter on Washington in this book that really refutes that. I think there's quite a lot. Was he a Catholic, as some Catholics acclaim? I don't know that there's as much evidence for that.
That may be going too far.
But I do think that in terms of this idea of him being like every other Enlightenment founder, I don't think so.
He was no Thomas Paine.
No.
No, who was pretty much an atheist.
Pretty much as close as you can get.
He would have been the extreme, in terms of his atheism. Jefferson would have been more of a deist, and Franklin was a deist who insisted on prayer.
he was, there's a great quote which is mentioned in Liberty's lines from John Adams. I'm paraphrasing, but Adams was very jealous of Franklin, his ability to be all things to all people. So he complained in a letter, the Catholics think he's a Catholic. The Quakers think he's a Quaker. Everybody thinks he's whatever they want him to be. So Franklin was circumspect, I think is the word we would use.
And in a certain sense, he was Catholic in the small c, because he used to go to church at every denomination in Philadelphia. And he went to Mass, observed, and he didn't, agree, but he was very respectful when he spoke about Mass. So that was the kind of deist he did. And when they, later on in the Constitutional Convention, they were just up against odds. And he said, gentlemen, let's stop and just take a day of prayer and fasting. And that was his suggestion. So again, there were deists, but it's not a simplistic kind of situation.
It isn't, and Franklin plays another really significant role in American Catholicism through his friendship with Father John Carroll, who will later become the first bishop and archbishop in America. And they go on a mission trip together in 1776. The Continental Congress sends them to Canada to try to persuade the Canadians to at least stay out of the Revolution, if not join the Patriot cause. So Franklin goes with Father John Carroll and his cousin, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and the mission is a failure. They don't persuade the Canadians really to do much of anything, but Father John Carroll sees that Franklin, who's aged at this time and is really suffering from the rigors of travel, he looks out for him. He gets a carriage so they can go back to Philadelphia. And Benjamin Franklin never forgets the kindness shown to him by Father John Carroll. And so later, after the Revolution, when negotiations are underway to find who is going to be the first Catholic bishop, Benjamin Franklin plays a significant role in those negotiations in putting forward the name of Father John Carroll because of those very simple kindnesses that Father showed him.
In addition to some of these Catholics that you're mentioning now, at the beginning of the show we mentioned foreign Catholics, Kazimierz Pułaski, who was from Poland. That sure isn't a name you find much in Philadelphia or London. And Tadeusz Kościuszko. Both of them were Polish patriots who had to leave their country because the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians had invaded Poland. What attracted them to come to America?
I think there are a couple of things. A lot of the foreign soldiers who did come to America to fight on the side of the Patriots, they were looking for an opportunity, opportunities that were foreclosed to them in their own countries. And there were a lot of people who were looking for those opportunities, so many that Benjamin Franklin put together an all-purpose letter, which he forwarded on to General Washington, which said something like, and I'm paraphrasing, this gentleman must have many fine qualifications which are known to him. I didn't have time to look for him, because he was seeing so many of these people who wanted a recommendation. And finally, Washington told him, look, you got to knock it off. Stop sending me all these people, because some of these guys are really no-hopers. But the Polish patriot...
And so the folks understand, one of the issues is that armies in Europe before the French Revolution were oftentimes very professional, that they had lots and lots of mercenaries. It's during the American Revolution and the French Revolution that you start to get these larger popular armies, the armies composed of regular citizens who are just defending their country. But prior to that, they were mostly these professionals, and that's just sort of floating around, these professionals.
That's true. In the case of the Polish patriots, though, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, here are a couple of guys who are patriots in their own country, and Pulaski in particular, wants to fight against the partitioning of his country by Russia and Prussia and Austria. And he's not successful. In fact, he has to leave Poland because he's a wanted man.
Yeah.
And so he comes to America, and in America, he gets not only a chance to show his military genius, he gets a chance to fight for an independence that sadly he's never going to have the opportunity to pursue in his own country. And the same is true for Kosciuszko, who does return after the revolution because he did survive, unlike Pulaski. He survives the revolution and returns to Poland. He manages, through his own military genius, to come very close to going toe-to-toe with the Russian army, but ultimately he's not successful, and he's going to be imprisoned for a couple of years. And it's only the death of Catherine the Great that gets him freed. But both of these guys, the short version of that is, they have an opportunity to do something in America that they do not have the opportunity to do in their home country. You could say the same thing, I suppose, about the French. Every other revolution that happened in Europe should make us appreciate the singularity of the American Revolution. This one worked out in a way none of the others did. And we have these guys in the book to prove it.
Yeah, see, that's something that's a very important element of our revolution. Even though there were a number of deists, there were also very strongly committed Protestants. Adams was a committed Protestant, and you have Catholics like Charles Carroll, who's one of the signers. So you've got these religious people, and Thomas Paine, I think, is the only atheist, but then a few other deists of different, and Anglicans, especially from the southern colonies. So it's a mixture. But religion and religious values were never far from them, unlike the French Revolution.
It's absolutely true, and it's one of the things in the chapter on Washington that I think gets glossed over. Washington saw that there was a role in government for religion. Not necessarily a particular religion, but he saw that there was a need for it because religion is one of the things that keeps people moral. And a moral people can be governed. Whereas an amoral or an immoral people, they're going to be a lot more difficult to govern. So Washington looked at it in practical terms, which I think a lot of people don't recognize about him.
Well, I think it was Washington who had talked about how the Constitution is fairly vague in terms of values. And he said it requires a people who are living a Christian life to be able to stay moral in such a relatively vague system. The Constitution doesn't tell you what to do every day. You assume moral values, and it gives a structure that permits freedom.
Which I think is the way that a lot of Americans, even today, even at this late date, I think that's the way a lot of Americans understand it. I think these other versions of things, the Jeffersonian version, the Madisonian version of it, that really try to take religion out of the picture and try to propagate a completely secular government, that's not the understanding that most people, even people who might, if they were hooked up to the polygraph, deny it. The understanding that a lot of us have is the Washingtonian one. The idea that we need religion because we need to have this moral structure in which a document like the Constitution can function. It doesn't work otherwise.
And on the other side, when you get rid of religious values, we see this in our schools, that a line from a letter by Thomas Jefferson about religious oppression in Connecticut said that there's a wall of separation between religion and the state. And he was writing that to protect religion from the state.
Encroachment by the state. It's one of If there were a world record for a line that's been taken out of context the most times, that would be on the short list for sure. I don't know if it would be the winner, but it would be on the short list.
But you have a lot of people who think that that is in the Constitution, and it is not. It's from a letter that Jefferson wrote years after, what, about 15 years after the Constitution
It was well
ratified.
afterward. It was well afterward.
Yeah, I think, a good 14, 15 years. And the reason that that's important is that as we remove religion, and you cannot teach thou shalt not kill in the public schools. The Supreme Court said you cannot teach the Ten Commandments. You end up having more and more laws limiting our freedom because you don't have internal religious values and moral values from God. So you have to create more and more laws so that people don't do bad stuff.
When people complain about the fact that we live in such a litigious society, I think they don't always draw the line from that to what you just said, which is, this is why we have to have more and more laws, because we have abandoned a lot of the infrastructure that animated these founding documents.
Yep. And again, Carroll was the only, Charles Carroll, that is, was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence.
He's the only Catholic, yes.
And he's the only the only Catholic signer. The rest were not Catholic. But what's amazing to me, and this is one of the points of your book, Catholics were, you could say, oppressed.
I think that's fair.
And at times violently persecuted. There was definitely violent. The first Jesuits to land in Virginia were shot immediately upon their arrival. So there was violence. And yet, a number of Catholics got into this enterprise to build. They didn't try to sabotage the country. They saw something. And tell us more about how you see their perspective.
You know, the $64 billion question is, why did these Catholics who were persecuted in the colonies, why would they sign on for an enterprise like this, going hand in hand, elbow to elbow with some of the people who have been persecuting them steadily for a long time? Why would they do that? And I don't think there's any singular answer, because it's such a personal and subjective thing, but I do think there are a couple points that ought to be made that at least show us the direction of this. One of them is the Jesuits. And not just Father John Carroll, but also people like Father Ferdinand Farmer and Father Pierre Gibault in the Mississippi, all along the Mississippi in the Western Territories. These are guys who are circuit riding priests. They are taking the faith to people because in most places you cannot attend a public mass. If you do attend mass, it is performed by a circuit riding priest, probably in secret. And
because it was illegal.
It was illegal. It was illegal in most of these places. So the priests are taking the faith to the faithful. But the other thing that they're doing, in part because of the suppression of the Society of Jesus, is these priests, for a limited amount of time while the suppression takes place, they're kind of free agents. They are no longer tethered to London the way that they would have been while the society was operational. And because of that, they're also free to take not just the faith, but this idea of independence. How many people did they win over in their circuit riding? It's hard to say, but there is a gentleman who's mentioned in the book, also a Maryland Jesuit, Father Joseph Mosley, who says, I had 250 people roughly in my flock, and I converted almost all of them to the patriot cause. Now, we don't know what the numbers were like for everybody else, but it seems inescapable that these circuit riding priests were a big part of convincing people to do what they did, which is most of the 24,000 to 30,000 colonial Catholics ended up patriots.
And so folks understand, you mentioned the suppression of the Jesuits. This was a move in the 1770s that went in stages, kicking Jesuits out of all the territory ruled by the Bourbon kings. So that was France, Spain, and Portugal. And then those countries threatened to attack the Papal States unless the Pope ended the Jesuits, suppressed it, and said it no longer exists. And this was all instigated by a combination of the Masonic Lodge, especially in Portugal and France, as well as by a group of French anti-religious philosophers who knew that we have to get rid of the Jesuits if we're going to have a revolution. And then that went on from there. So that is what you're talking about in terms of the suppression.
It is. And if not for the suppression, Father John Carroll probably never comes back to America. He probably stays in Belgium and lives out his life there where he's very happy. He never comes back. He therefore never goes on the mission to Canada. He never meets Benjamin Franklin. Mm-hmm. And he certainly then never becomes the first Catholic bishop in America. Mm-hmm. If not for the suppression of the Jesuits, he would have never returned to Maryland in the first place, most likely. Yeah. And there are other Jesuits who made their way to America, again, because of the suppression. There was nothing left for them in Europe.
They formed an organization in Maryland called the Catholic Gentlemen of Maryland. I think that province is still incorporated under that name, or named something like that, so that they stayed somewhat together, but they were no longer a religious order.
No, and again, not having to report to a superior in England meant that they were free to consider this idea of liberty in a way that would have been very difficult, most likely, had the society still been operational. And it's a small window. I mean, the society is suppressed and then it is reinstituted. But it just so happens that this whole revolutionary period happens inside of that window of suppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, there were always Jesuits. The way that the bull of suppression was written is that it had to be read in the country where the Jesuits lived. That the Pope did that on purpose. So for it to take effect, it had to be read in that country. And Catherine the Great of Russia wouldn't have let the papal couriers bring it there. So the Jesuits who lived in the part of Poland that Russia had conquered, they were able to stay as Jesuits. And then it spread back from there.
So one nice thing Catherine the Great did for Catholics.
Exactly, exactly. This is a very important thing too, because one of the points you make is not only was this convenient that they could, as former Jesuits, be circuit riders, stay in America, and win people over to the cause of the American patriots. But they liked these ideals. Why is that?
They like these ideals. I think to get at that, you have to go back to that Catholic colony of Maryland. And what happens in Maryland is very early on, Maryland has a charter which enshrines religious liberty as part of the founding of the colony. Again, as we said earlier, sometimes that's true, a lot of times it's not true. But Maryland does have some high watermarks. The Religious Toleration Act of 1649 is in the British Empire kind of a watershed moment. So Maryland has this history and it has this charter. And by virtue of having this history and this charter, Maryland Catholics realize there's really nothing connecting them to England anymore. They have become something completely separate and independent. They're no longer just England transplanted geographically.
Right.
And because of this, Maryland Catholics figured out before anybody else that, hey, we are our own thing. We don't need England anymore. We are separate. We are independent. And it's for that reason that intellectually, the roots of the revolution really come from these Maryland Catholics. And Charles Carroll of Carrollton will later take this baton and run with it in the first citizen letters and really show everybody what those colonial Catholics in Maryland were talking about when they declared that their religious liberty kind of made them independent from England.
Especially since the King of England was the head of the Anglican Church, and they were neither Anglican and they had religious freedom. So that separation was there. We have to take a little break. We're going to come back in a little bit. So please stay with us and continue this conversation and see how perhaps a Jesuit saint even was quoted in the Declaration of Independence. Stay with us. All right, we are speaking with Dan Leroy about his book, Liberty's Lions, The Catholic Revolutionaries Who Established America. And this book by Dan Leroy is available at EWTNRC.com, our religious catalog. It's item number 1169. And so you can get it there. Good thing to do. And, you know, as we come into a period where people are knowing less about American founding, and sometimes falsehoods are being said about the American founding, ideological falsehoods.
It's one reason I sometimes refer to this book as the Anti-1619 Project.
Why would you think that?
I would think that...
Well, first of all, what do you mean by the 1619 Project?
That is the New York Times effort to set the date of the founding of our country, not in 1776, but in 1619, with the beginnings of slavery. And the similarities are that in this book and in the 1619 Project, we're both talking about the same approximate era, and we're both looking at that era and coming up with some ideas that are a little bit counter to what a lot of people believe. The difference is that the ideas in this book are things that are based on research and facts, things that really happened, whereas the central tenet of the 1619 Project, which is that the colonists wanted to fight a revolution to preserve slavery, that's just not true.
Yeah.
And so when I say anti-1619 Project, that's what I'm talking about.
Because in fact, a very close friend of mine, an African-American minister, who actually survived the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church by the Ku Klux Klan in the early 60s. And he's not someone who's just sort of floating around. And he was inside the church when they set off the bomb, but he was in a different room than the little girls that got killed. And so he was cut up, but, you know. So at any rate, he was just teaching me the other day that Thomas Jefferson tried to include a suppression of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but he could not get the southern colonies of Georgia, the two Carolinas, or Virginia to go along with it.
It was a deal-breaking issue. And if you look at all the compromises that had to be made to keep the country together, you know, they don't always make you happy. History would have been a lot more fun if we could have sorted these things out a lot earlier. But in a lot of cases, the choice that was facing the founders was we deal with this particular issue, which is an evil, which is something that the magisterium of the church sorted out a long time ago as an evil. We can solve this problem now, we can keep the country together.
Yeah.
And they chose to keep the country together, and at great cost to a lot of people. It is not an unblemished history by any means, but it is history.
Yeah.
And we can't rewrite it to make it something different than what it was.
Exactly. And it was, Jefferson could see that the statement that all men are created equal with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness granted them by their Creator. And he knew that that was flat against the slavery, that slavery undercut that truth, but he couldn't persuade delegates to the Continental Convention to agree to this in the Declaration.
Well, one of the guys that we've talked about already, who's mentioned in Liberty's Alliance, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, is a guy who is an ardent abolitionist. And in fact, those same words that you were just mentioning, he's a close friend of Jefferson, but he can't understand how a guy who writes these beautiful words can also be a slave owner.
Yeah.
And one of the things Kosciuszko does is his dying wish is that Jefferson will take the money that he, Kosciuszko, has earned during the American Revolution and use it to free as many of his slaves as possible. That's all he wanted. But then he died, and Jefferson said, in essence, I don't know if I can do this. It's too complicated, too many claims on your estate. And so he kind of left it up to the courts, and as a result, those slaves were sold, and they were not freed. But Kosciuszko represents another side of this relationship between Catholicism and slavery. He is a guy who would have given anybody the shirt off his back. He would have given up everything he owned to make good on the principles that he believed in, which, again, are the principles that are consistent with Catholicism.
Yeah. And just to remind our audience that Catholic teaching had put the slave trade under automatic excommunication in 1425, 1436. I mean, that's decades before Columbus sailed to America, but it was already under automatic excommunication, and that was repeated every century, after that. So by the popes, people didn't listen.
No.
But there were people like Kosciuszko who took their Catholicism seriously and that value of liberty. And then there were others who didn't.
We got them today.
Yep. Yeah, look at the abortion issue. You have some people who know that there's an automatic excommunication for abortion, but they procure them or they support the procurement of them. And this is as vile as slavery, if not more vile, because the child is dead in a horrible way. So it's the same dynamic that's going on. Another element, though, that I think is worth bringing up is in that line that all men are created equal with rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness granted them by their Creator. That goes to St. Robert Bellarmine, a Jesuit, and Thomas Jefferson cited that.
It's just one more example of how important the Jesuits, Jesuit thinkers, Jesuit priests, how important they are to this story. If there's a subtext to a lot of Liberty's lines, I hope it is that people recognize how important this order was, not just to Catholicism, but to the founding of our country. And that example you gave in one of the most important founding documents is a great example of that.
In Catholicism had never accepted the divine right of kings. That was what Bellarmine was arguing against. It was King James I who pushed divine right of kings and other kings of England, but the church never held that as a doctrine.
Catholics had a lot of reasons, especially in England, to argue against the divine right of kings.
You know, the kings come and go, kingdoms and empires come and go. Papacy sort of keeps moving along, just, you know, with all of its troubles, it keeps there. But Divine Right of Kings was not Catholic teaching.
No.
And that made it possible for the colonists to separate from the King of England.
Absolutely. It's one of the underpinnings of this idea that we're not going to have a king here, that we are going to have a different structure. And again, that goes back to those Maryland Catholics who saw early on what we're doing here in the colonies. It's a different thing. This is not just an extension of England. We are starting a completely new enterprise, and as such, it's going to need a completely new head of this enterprise, and it's not going to be a king.
Yeah. And, you know, in some ways, the other colonies had a certain element of that. I mean, the Puritans were also persecuted by the Anglicans after they had persecuted the Anglicans themselves. You know, they didn't get along within Protestantism either. But they also had a sense of, we don't really have such a strong tie to the king.
They did, and it's one of the instances of common ground, which I guess is a partial answer to that earlier question about, you know, not just why did Catholics do what they did, but how did Catholic fortunes turn around as quickly as they did? Because after the Revolution, there's a period where things kind of settled down. Now, it doesn't last, and once we get into the middle of the 19th century and the know-nothings and the response to immigration from Ireland, from Italy, then, you know, it becomes a different situation. But there is this period of kind of post-revolutionary calm where Catholics are certainly tolerated in a way that they have not been before. And it is this period in the end of the 18th, early 19th century, this period of peace that allows the church in America to really get its feet underneath it. They had a lot of challenges. John Carroll, Father John Carroll, was really up against it as the first bishop and archbishop in America. But one of the things that he didn't have to contend with as much was the persecution that had gone on really for the 150 years preceding the Revolution. So they got this space where they were able to work things out, get their feet under them, and, you know, then they had to do it all again by the middle of the 19th century.
But they could start establishing new dioceses. Philadelphia became a diocese, and other dioceses were formed from Philadelphia. So the structure of the church started to expand in America after the Revolution.
One of the things that I think is a takeaway, I hope, from this book is when you think about that group of colonial Catholics, 24 to 30,000 people, less than 2% of the colonial population, and you think that out of this little mustard seed of people came the faith that would become dominant in America.
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of things to worry about. There are a lot of things to get down about. But I think the example of this little group of colonial Catholics and what they became, we are what they have become. I think it's a really optimistic take at a time when optimism is hard to come by. But I hope that's something that people who read Liberty's Lions will take away from it.
You know, to help folks again get a perspective, you know, Catholics are about 70 million out of 320 million in the country. So we're nearly a fourth of the country. Meanwhile, the founding religions that were the official religions of colonies like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, New York, the then Anglicans, now Episcopalians, they're only about 1.3 million. And the Presbyterians that were from the founding religion of New Jersey are about 1.1 million. And the Puritans of New England are less than 1 million. Well, less than 1 million.
I mean, numbers aren't everything,
No,
but
no.
numbers, those numbers are certainly trending in completely opposite directions. It's something that I think we forget about to our cost today, that, where we have come from and where we've ended
Right.
up, that it's pretty radically different. And I don't know that that is a number, speaking of numbers, I don't know that's a number that a lot of people really appreciate. Some people, I think, believe that Catholics have always been here and they've always kind of had the position that they've had. And not exactly, not so much.
No. That again, we went from a time when priests were hunted down before the Revolution, and churches were burned. When they did allow it, they still burned churches, and now, the Catholic churches and clergy everywhere. So this is a big change, and Catholics have, especially I think after you mentioned the big immigrations of the 1800s, large groups of Catholics came, and the world wars demonstrated their love of this country and their patriotism, and that's important too.
It is important because going back to this first group of colonial Catholics, they joined a cause with which they had a lot of reasons to not join, or at least sit out. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't demand any special treatment. They didn't say, we'll join you if we get X, Y, and Z.
Right.
They didn't ask for a thing. They just joined up. And I think in that lesson, of all the lessons in Liberty's Lines, is really something that I would hope still resonates with people today. They thought this idea was worth signing on for without making any conditions whatsoever, the beginning of it. And if they didn't do what they did, we wouldn't be here talking about America today.
Yeah.
And we're used to groups saying, yes, I'll join your cause, but you got to do this, that, this, that, this, that, and this for me. That's not how Catholics did it. They didn't do it in the colonial era. They didn't do it in the 19th century. They didn't do it in the world wars. They just signed up and fought on the side of America.
But again, that's one of the things that I think is key to your book, is that there was this ability of Catholics to understand the values of freedom. And even though Catholics were accused of being under the total control of the Pope and things, they really got the issue of freedom and freedom of religion and freedom of thought, and they thought it was worth working for.
They had to, because otherwise why would they have done what they did? It doesn't make any sense any other way to imagine. There was nothing else in it for them. And in fact, in doing so, they were making a huge leap of faith. They were aligning themselves with people who until yesterday had been actively persecuting them.
Right.
They had to believe in this ideal, and again, they believed in it without any preconditions. There's something in there, I think, for all of us today. The litmus test of a book about history is, what's in it for me? What does this have to say about my life today?
That was going to be my next question. What do you think?
Well,
for Catholics reading this today and seeing, the state of the country, where there are a lot of questions about patriotism. Why should people stay loyal to the idea of the United States, to the Constitution of the United States, to the government? What is there that we should do, and what would be a good Catholic response based on this history?
What I would say about that is, when I was finishing this book, I did it in the middle of a pandemic. And I don't have to repeat all the stuff that went on, because everybody knows it, everybody lived through it. Some people are still living through it. Churches are shut. You can't attend Mass. Easter, the high point of the liturgical year, is a washout in a lot of places. And it's a great spiritual hardship for millions of people. But then I think about the examples of the Catholics in this book, the colonial Catholics who took this leap of faith that we were just talking about. Those Catholics knew a little something about government overreach into their spiritual lives. And again, they put that aside, they persevered, and they got us to where we are today. And they had to make sacrifices, they had to suffer. And their response to sacrifice and suffering was not, oh man, this isn't fair. It's not fair that I can only go to one Mass a year because the circuit rider serves us. That's the only time he comes by. And actually this year Mass got canceled because the weather was bad, so it has to be next year. You know, you can suffer that way and you can throw up your hands. They didn't throw up their hands. We can't throw up our hands either.
Yeah, I think that's exactly one of the key things. A lot of sometimes I sense a temptation to think, oh, well, this has got to be the end times. Things are so terrible that, Lord Jesus, just come and get it over with. But if he doesn't, we have work to do.
We do. And the work started here in America with these colonial Catholics. And I think they are an example to us. You know, what does history have to do with me? I think they have everything to do with us, especially now, especially in the conditions that we are under today. Their example is more important now, maybe, than ever.
Yeah. And I think that this is a way to help us think about what are these American values? How does freedom and the structure of our government coordinate with our Catholic teaching? You know, just to think that even the virtue of patriotism is seen by the Catholic Church as an extension of honoring your father and mother, that you honor where your family came from, and that includes your whole country. These are important values for us to recover when there's this attempt to, you know, we've certainly seen, and I've been listening to promoters of this this racial project, saying that we white people are bad, we're all bad. No, we're created equal. And we have to respect people of all the races. We have to respect ourselves too, and the values. This is going to be the Catholic perspective on this.
It goes back to something that you said earlier, which is these are not things that can be litigated to be solved. These are issues that have to be solved on a moral plane.
Yeah.
And that is our responsibility as Catholics, to make that moral plane consistent with the obligations that our country asks of us. It's difficult sometimes, but that's not a throw up your hands moment either.
No, that's why the first Catholic president said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's how he started his presidency. And that gets at these Catholic values really well. I just want to again let people know, because we're out of time, sadly, but your book is called Liberty's Lions, The Catholic Revolutionaries Who Established America. It's by Dan Leroy. You can get it at ewtnrc.com, where it is item number 1169. You can also go to danleroy.com, find about, because you've done a number of other books.
I have.
With Sophia Press and others. So I want to let people know about that, Sophia Institute. Thank you for being with us and helping us to get ready to celebrate our Independence Day. Thank you for joining us, and may the Lord God bless you and our whole nation, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we can bring Dan and all of our other guests and programs to you only because this network is brought to you by you. So please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll pay our bills too. God bless you.